Okay, well, good day. Today's devotion comes from Matthew chapter 26, verses 17, 18, and 19. The parallel verses can be found in Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 16, and Luke chapter 22, verses 7 through 13. I will be using some excerpts from there to help out our understanding of today's verses. Now, Matthew 26, verse 17 through 19. Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. Well, a little background here. The Passover meal was prepared during the daylight hours of the 13th of the month Nisan, and eaten on the 14th day of the month Nisan during the twilight period, which started at sundown. Now, Mark 14, verse 12, and Luke 22, verse 7 tell us that this was the day the Passover lamb was to be slain. The Passover meal occurred after the close of that day, sundown, which was the start of the 14th day. Then, following the Passover feast, was a whole week that was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, the Passover and the Feast of the Unleavened Bread were so closely related and so close in time that over a period of time they became known as one feast of 8 days, which was either referred to as the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or both names. We find evidence of this in all the different Gospels, as well in the historian Josephus' writings in the late 1st century. Now, the disciples took for granted that Jesus was going to eat the Passover meal and that he would do it according to the time prescribed by God's law. They knew that preparations had to be made, and they knew it was their job to do that. But Christ had no home here on earth, so they wouldn't pick just any place. They went to him for directions. Now, in Matthew's account, verse 18 does not give much detail. In fact, it seems like that Jesus deliberately chose secret and vague words here, and then unrecorded is some miracle that occurred that allowed the disciples to find that certain man. Perhaps Jesus had already made arrangements with a certain man and arranged a password phrase so that man would recognize his disciples when they appeared. Perhaps. But how would they know which man it was? Well, Mark and Luke's accounts give us a little more detail, but it's still somewhat vague. Carrying a jug of water, going into the city. Perhaps Judas was present when Jesus was speaking to the disciples in answer to their question. And Jesus chose secrecy and vagueness to keep Judas from being tempted and arranging the arrest site to be inside the city, and the result being the shedding of innocent blood. However, we do have one addition that we get from Luke's account. The names of the disciples who were sent to make the preparations. Peter and John. Okay, what preparations would they do? Well, the slaying of the lamb was probably handled by the householder. The preparation of the unleavened loaves, the preparation of the salt water, the gathering of the bitter herbs, the creating the sauce, the gathering of the cups, as well as the wine, and finally the preparation of the actual room. Now, the Greek word used in the original manuscripts indicates it was this last task that was what was intended, and that the certain man had done all the other tasks. Well, what can we suppose about this certain man? Well, first, that he was a believer. Second, that there was some kind of understanding between him and the Lord. And number 3, of course, secrecy and caution was involved. What are our takeaways? Well, first of all, there are secret friends of God in all times, ready at the critical moment to do the Lord's will or his service. We see this in the friend at Bethphage. We see it in this certain man in Jerusalem. We see it in Joseph of Arimathea, and we also see it in Nicodemus. They, like Esther in the Old Testament, were called for such a time as then. Well, what about you and I? How would we know if we are called for a time to do a critical task for a critical moment? Well, I only know of one way. Watch and pray and watch. That's the only way I know of to be in the Lord's will, not ahead of it, not behind it, and to be ready on a moment's notice. I hope this devotion has been encouraging to you, and thanks for watching.